The day Lillian Fletcher stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she wore a hat pulled so low over her face that the driver thought she might be hiding from God himself. And the truth was, she was hiding from something very nearly as relentless. The town of Caldwell sat just north of the Cherokee Strip, a rough and restless place where cattle drives came up from Texas along the Kishom Trail, where saloons outnumbered churches 3-1, and where a person could, if they were careful and quiet enough, simply become no one. That was Lillian's plan. That was the entirety of it. She had folded her old life like a letter she never wanted to read again, tucked it somewhere deep inside her chest where it could not get out, and she had come to the Kansas territory with $42, a carpetbag, and a name she was already thinking of abandoning. She was 26 years old. She had dark chestnut hair that she kept pinned severely under that hat. She had gray eyes the color of a sky just before a storm decides what it wants to do. She was not a small woman, not fragile in the way that some men expected women to be, but there was something about the way she held her shoulders, slightly inward, slightly braced, that told anyone paying attention that she had taken blows before, not the kind that leave marks you can see. The stagecoach depot was a squat building with a porch that needed fixing. A man with a red beard was arguing with the depot clerk about a missing parcel. Two cowboys lounged against the hitching post with the easy, sun-dried posture of men who belonged nowhere and were entirely comfortable with that fact. A woman in a calico dress was trying to manage 3 small children and a basket of eggs simultaneously. Caldwell smelled like horse and dust and the distant sweetness of cottonwood blossoms, and Lillian breathed it in and thought, yes, this will do. She had chosen Caldwell specifically because it was a cattle town, a transient place, a town where strangers were the rule rather than the exception. People came and went with the drives. Nobody asked too many questions. That was the theory anyway. She picked up her carpetbag and walked toward the main street. She had enough money for perhaps 2 weeks at a boarding house, and after that she would need work. She had considered this on the long, jolting ride from Kansas City. She could cook. She could sew. She was a reasonably good seamstress, actually, having spent the better part of her childhood at her mother's knee learning the particular patience that needlework required. She could also keep ledgers, having helped her late father with his accounts before everything had gone so terribly wrong in St. Louis, but she thought it might be wiser not to advertise that particular skill too broadly. Ledger work meant questions about her history, references, names of former employers. She would stick to sewing. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Beaumont, who was somewhere between 50 and ancient, with a spine so straight it looked like it had been pressed with an iron, and eyes that saw entirely too much. She looked Lillian up and down when she arrived at the door and said without preamble, "You running from a husband or the law?" "Neither," Lillian said, which was approximately true. Mrs. Beaumont studied her for another long moment and then stepped aside. $1.50 a week, meals included, no men above the ground floor after 8. You cause trouble, you go. You keep to yourself and pay on time. You can stay as long as the territory will have you. That suits me perfectly, Lillian said. The room was small and clean, with a window that looked out onto the alley behind the building, which suited Lillian just fine. She didn't want a view of the street. She didn't want to watch people passing and wonder if any of them had followed her here. She sat on the narrow bed after Mrs. Beaumont left, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs, and she made herself breathe slowly until the trembling stopped. His name had been Robert Haynes. She had been engaged to him for 8 months in St. Louis, believing him to be a respectable merchant, a kind if somewhat cold man who had offered her security at a time when her father's debts had made security feel like a luxury she could not afford to refuse. It had taken her most of those 8 months to understand what he actually was, what he dealt in, who his associates were. And when she had tried to leave quietly, when she had simply packed a bag and gone to stay with her cousin, Robert had made it very clear through a series of increasingly frightening encounters that he did not consider their arrangement to be over simply because she wished it to be. She had not gone to the law. The law innocent. Louis, she had come to understand, was not particularly interested in protecting women from men of Robert Haynes's standing and connections. She had instead gone to the train station, and then the stage depot, and then kept going until the land opened up and the sky got so big it felt like it might swallow her whole, and that had felt, for the first time in a long while, like safety. She would disappear. She would become someone small and unremarkable in a large and unremarkable place. She would sew dresses and keep her head down and let Lillian Fletcher of St. Louis simply cease to exist. That was the plan. She had not counted on Henry Whitfield. He was not, at first glance, a remarkable man. He was 30 years old, built in the particular way of men who spent their lives outdoors, which is to say lean and weathered and economical in his movements, without an ounce of excess about him. He had dark hair that needed cutting, brown eyes that were warm but watchful, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same sandstone as the bluffs along the Cimarron. He wore a plain gray shirt, brown canvas trousers, worn boots, and a hat that had seen several hard seasons. He did not carry himself with the swagger of the cowboys who drifted through Caldwell with their trail money and their loud opinions. He carried himself quietly, the way a man does who is used to moving through country that doesn't announce itself. He was, as it happened, a tracker, not a bounty hunter, though some people made that mistake. Henry Whitfield found things: lost cattle, stolen horses, missing persons, runaway children, a surveyor's pack that had fallen into a creek bed in a storm. He had a particular and remarkable gift for it, the kind of gift that people in the territory had come to rely upon, and that he himself was somewhat bemused by, as if he had simply stumbled into a skill the way you stumble over a root in the dark and found it useful enough to keep. He had grown up on the Kansas plains, the son of a homesteading family that had not survived the land as well as they had hoped. His mother had died when he was 12, his father had died when he was 19, and Henry had spent the decade between then and now moving through the territory, learning its moods and its languages, spending time enough with the Osage and the Kiowa to understand that the land spoke to people who were willing to listen, and that most people simply were not listening. He arrived in Caldwell on a Tuesday in late April, because a rancher named Gideon Marsh had hired him to find 3 horses that had been stolen from his operation out near the Strip. It was the kind of job Henry could usually resolve in a few days. He took a room at the same boarding house because Mrs. Beaumont's was the cleanest establishment in town that did not also serve whiskey, and Henry was a man who preferred to be clear-headed in the mornings. He first saw Lillian at breakfast on Wednesday. She was already at the table when he came down, sitting very straight in her chair with her eyes on her coffee cup, and his first impression was of someone who was trying very hard to be invisible and was very nearly succeeding. His second impression, which came a fraction of a second later in that particular way that impressions do when they are important, was that she was the most quietly compelling person he had seen in a very long time. He could not have explained it if asked. It was nothing so simple as physical beauty, though she was certainly striking. It was something about the quality of stillness around her, a stillness that was not peaceful but was instead the kind that exists around the eye of a storm. He sat down at the far end of the table because she clearly preferred not to be addressed, and he ate his eggs and drank his coffee and minded his own business, and she did not speak to him, and he did not speak to her, and it was, by any objective measure, a thoroughly unremarkable breakfast. But he noticed her. He noticed the way her hands tightened on the coffee cup when Mrs. Beaumont's rooster startled her with a crow outside the window. He noticed that she ate quickly and efficiently and without pleasure, the way a person eats when food is fuel and nothing more. He noticed that she sat with her back to the wall and her chair angled slightly toward the door. He noticed that her carpetbag, which she had brought down from her room for some reason and set beside her chair, was very slightly overpacked in the way of someone who is not entirely certain they are staying. Henry Whitfield noticed these things the way he noticed everything, without drama, without jumping to conclusions, simply noting and filing and continuing to observe. He went about his work that day. He rode out to the north pasture where the tracks were and spent the better part of the morning on his hands and knees in the dry grass, reading the story that the ground had left behind. 3 horses, unshod except for one, stolen at night, taken west before being redirected north. He marked his trail and rode back into town for supplies and information, which was how he ended up at the general store at 2:30 in the afternoon at the exact same moment that Lillian Fletcher was attempting, with limited success, to negotiate a price for needle and thread. "I can't go lower than 12 cents for the lot," the store owner, a stout man named Perkins, was saying with the particular stubbornness of a man who knows he has the only store for 20 miles. "I'll give you 8, Lillian said. Her voice was steady and low. Henry liked the sound of it immediately. 10, said Perkins. 9, and I'll tell Mrs. Beaumont about the quality of your last barrel of flour, Lillian said pleasantly, and the way she said it with that unruffled calm made Perkins laugh despite himself and give her the 9 cents, and Henry found himself suppressing a smile behind a display of horse liniment. She turned as she was leaving and found him standing there, and for one brief and unguarded moment he saw something flicker in those gray eyes, a flash of alarm quickly suppressed, and she gave him the briefest of nods and walked out. He bought his supplies and told himself it was none of his business. He told himself that for approximately 3 days, during which he solved the matter of the stolen horses, which had been taken by a drifter who had tried to sell them in Wichita, and had been apprehended before Henry even needed to ride up to meet the sheriff there, which wrapped things up rather more quickly than expected and left Henry with a small bonus and no particular reason to leave Caldwell immediately. He had enough to do in Caldwell as it happened. There was always something. A farmer east of town had been trying for 2 years to find where his fence line actually ended, there being a dispute with his neighbor, and needed someone to help him read the original survey markers. A woman whose husband had gone to get supplies in Wichita 3 weeks ago and had not returned wanted someone to ask some careful questions. A boy of about 12 had lost his dog in the creek bottom and was inconsolable. Henry found the survey markers. He found out, gently and carefully, that the woman's husband had not met with foul play but had simply left for reasons that were his own failing and not his wife's, which was the hardest kind of finding to report. But he reported it honestly and sat with the woman while she cried and made sure she had neighbors who would look in on her. He found the dog, which was a spotted hound named General who had gotten his back foot caught in some roots and was hungry and indignant but otherwise fine. That was Henry. That was what he was. He had not gone looking for anything to do with Lillian Fletcher. He would have told you that quite firmly. He was simply a man going about his business in a small town, and she was a woman going about hers, and if he was more aware than usual of when she left and when she returned, if he listened a little more attentively than necessary when Mrs. Beaumont mentioned that the new boarder had asked about seamstress work and had 3 commissions already from ladies in town, well, that was just the nature of living in close quarters. It didn't mean anything. The thing that changed it, the thing that made it impossible to keep pretending it was nothing, happened on a Friday evening in early May. Henry was returning late from the creek bottom, having spent the afternoon helping relocate that survey marker, and he came around the back of the boarding house and stopped because there was a man standing in the alley. A man Henry didn't recognize, which was notable in itself because Henry was quite good at knowing who was in town and who wasn't. The man was standing very still and looking up at the windows of the boarding house with an intensity that made the hair on Henry's arms stand up. He was well dressed for Caldwell. Too well dressed. Eastern clothes, a good coat, shoes rather than boots. He had a thick, dark mustache and the kind of posture that came from a lifetime of having other people move out of your way. Henry stood in the shadow of the outbuilding and watched, and the man watched the windows for another long moment, and then he did something that settled it entirely. He took a small leather-bound notebook from his coat pocket and wrote something in it, quickly and precisely, and put it back. Then he walked away, back toward the main street, with the unhurried confidence of a man who has found what he was looking for and intends to come back for it at a time of his own choosing. Henry stood in the alley for a moment and thought. He went inside and ate his supper and said nothing about it, and all through the meal he watched Lillian across the table and thought about the way she sat facing the door, and the overpacked carpet bag, and the flash of alarm in her eyes at the store. And he turned the pieces over and looked at them from different angles the way he turned tracks over in his mind. And slowly, the shape of the thing began to emerge. She was hiding from someone. And that someone, or one of his agents, had found her anyway. He did not know what to do with that. It was not his business. He was very clear with himself about that. He was not the law, and he was not a protector, and he had not been asked. And the most sensible thing was to simply not be involved. He thought about that almost until morning. The next day was Saturday, and the boarding house had no assigned chores for Saturday mornings, and Lillian sat in the small parlor by the window with her sewing, which had become her habit. She was working on a dress for the wife of a local rancher, a blue calico with a complicated collar, and she worked with the focused precision that was its own kind of disappearing. The way her hands knew what to do and her mind could go somewhere else entirely. Henry came to the doorway of the parlor, hat in hand. "Miss Fletcher," he said. She looked up. There was that guardedness, immediate and complete. "Mr. Whitfield." He was quiet for a moment, which was his way, thinking through how to say the thing. He sat down in the chair across from her, not too close, and set his hat on his knee and said, "I need to tell you something that I saw last night, and I'd be obliged if you'd hear me out before you decide what you think about it." She set down her sewing very carefully. "All right," she said. Her voice was perfectly level. Only her hands, he noticed, had stilled entirely, the way animals go still when they are listening for a threat. He described the man in the alley. He described him plainly and without embellishment: the clothes, the posture, the notebook. He described the way the man had looked at the windows. He said nothing about his conclusions. He simply laid out what he had seen and waited. The color had left her face completely by the time he finished. But she didn't panic. She didn't fall apart. She looked at him for a long, measuring moment, gray eyes steady and cool, and said, "How do I know you're not involved with him?" Henry had expected the question. "You don't," he said. "Not for certain. But if I was involved with whoever that man is, I'd have gone and told him you were in room 4 instead of coming to you. I'm telling you what I saw because it seemed like something you'd want to know, and because it seemed like something was wrong, and that's the whole of it." Another long silence. Then she exhaled a small, controlled breath and said, "His name is Robert Haynes. I was engaged to him in St. Louis. I broke the engagement and left the city. He is not someone who accepts that kind of thing gracefully." "Are you in danger from him?" She looked at her hands. "He's never struck me. He's very careful about that sort of thing. He's a man who harms people through other means. Financial ruin, reputation, arrangements with certain kinds of men who do the physical work while he keeps his hands clean." She paused. "The man in the alley sounds like one of those men. Then he's been sent to report back your location." "Almost certainly." Henry was quiet for a moment, thinking. "How did you leave? Did anyone know where you were going?" "I told my cousin I was going west. I didn't specify further." "Your cousin might have been asked." "My cousin would not have told him willingly. But she doesn't know how to lie particularly well under pressure." Lillian said it without bitterness, just as fact. Henry turned his hat in his hands. "You could leave," he said. "Move on to another town. But if he has resources enough to send a man after you, he might have the patience to keep doing it." "I know," she said quietly. "I've been thinking about that since I got here." "Then there's another option," he said. "Stay, but not as someone he's looking for. He's looking for Lillian Fletcher, alone, hiding. What if you were neither of those things? She looked at him steadily. I'm not sure what you're suggesting, Mr. Whitfield. I'm suggesting that a woman who is known and visible and established in a community is harder to remove quietly than a woman who is already trying to be invisible, he said. You've got 3 commissions for sewing already. People know you here. Mrs. Beaumont talks. If you're not hiding, you're not a secret. And if you're not a secret, he can't use the threat of exposure. She studied him for a long moment. You've thought about this quite carefully for someone who says it's none of his business. He looked slightly caught. I find it difficult to see a problem I can't think through, he admitted. Something shifted in her face then, very slightly, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it, a fractional softening. And the man in the alley, what would you suggest about him? I'd like to find out who he is and who sent him, Henry said. If it's who you think, then at the very least we know the threat is confirmed and we can make better decisions. If I'm wrong and it's something else, then you've worried over nothing. Lillian was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, very carefully, as if measuring each word, "Why are you doing this?" He considered the question honestly. "Because I saw something wrong and I have the ability to address it," he said. "And because you seem like a person who's been managing something very large entirely on your own for a long time." The silence stretched between them, but it was a different kind of silence now, something with more air in it, less like a wall and more like a window. "His name might be Caldwell," she said. "The man in the alley. I think that's one of Haynes's regular men." "First name I don't know." Henry nodded and stood. "I'll be careful," he said. "And Miss Fletcher, in the meantime, don't change your routine. Do exactly what you do on any other day. The worst thing you can do is run, because running tells him he was right." She looked up at him. "You're very certain about this?" "I track things for a living," he said simply. "I know how the hunted thinks, and I know how the hunter thinks, and right now the best advantage you have is that he hasn't reported back yet. Let's use that time well." He left, and Lillian sat very still in the parlor for several minutes, looking at nothing, and then she picked up her sewing and continued the collar, but her stitches were slightly less precise than usual for the rest of the morning. Henry found his man by Tuesday. He did it the way he did most things, quietly and methodically, without drawing attention. He asked around the saloons and livery stables and the depot, describing the man without explaining why he was describing him, framing it as a casual inquiry. He found that a man named Willis, not Caldwell, had been in Caldwell for 4 days, staying at the less reputable of the 2 hotels, and had been asking questions about boarding houses and their occupants, framing them as questions from a concerned relative. Henry also found, through the particular informal network that existed in frontier towns among people who noticed things, that Willis had sent a letter east on Monday morning. He reported this to Lillian that evening on the porch, speaking quietly while the last of the sunset turned the sky amber and rose behind the water tower. "Then Haynes knows where I am," she said. There was no dramatics in it, just the flat acknowledgement of a woman who had been preparing for exactly this. "He knows you're in Caldwell. He doesn't know what you're doing here or who you know, and his man has left, so he's not watching anymore. Haynes will have to decide what to do with the information, and that takes time, and time is useful." Henry paused. "Do you know what he'll do when he comes?" "He'll try to come in the capacity of a concerned fiancé," she said. "He'll make it look like a reconciliation. He'll be very public and very charming, and he'll try to make me look either mad or unreasonable if I refuse. He's very good at that." She looked at her hands in her lap. "Incent. Louis, he has enough influence that most people believe whatever picture of him he chooses to present. Here, he has none of that." "Then here is where we stand," Henry said. "If you want to stay in Caldwell, then you stay and you live your life, and you are not hiding from anyone because you are established and known and you have friends. And if he comes, you deal with him in the daylight, in public, in a place where his usual methods don't work." "That's easier to say than to do." "Most things are," he agreed. Then, after a pause, "I'll be here if you want that. I'm not going anywhere in particular for the next while." She looked at him sideways. The amber light was doing something to her face, finding the warm undertones in her hair and her skin, and Henry made himself look at the water tower instead. "Why would you stay?" "Because I've taken a liking to Caldwell," he said, and then added more honestly, "and because I don't leave things unfinished." A pause, and then the corner of her mouth moved. "I am not a lost horse, Mr. Whitfield." "No," he said, "you are considerably more complicated." This time she actually smiled, brief and unwilling and real, and he felt it somewhere below his sternum and catalogued it with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. Over the next few weeks, something shifted slowly between them, the way the season shifts in May on the Kansas plains, not all at once but in the accumulation of small warmths, the days lengthening and the air softening and the grass coming up green where before there had been only gray-brown dormancy. Henry had always been good at being patient. It was part of what made him such a fine tracker. He did not press things. He did not reach for the conclusion before the evidence warranted it. He let things develop at their own speed, which was the right speed always, no matter how much the impatient part of you wanted to rush it. He walked with Lillian to church on the first Sunday of May, not because either of them was particularly devout, but because she had decided to be visible and he had offered to accompany her, and it was the kind of thing that established a person in a community's understanding. People saw them together and formed impressions, and those impressions became part of who Lillian was in Caldwell, a woman with a place and a connection, not a stranger blowing through. He walked with her to pick up thread at Perkins' store, and they argued amicably about the relative merits of different colors of calico, which was not a subject Henry had any prior opinions about but found himself developing opinions on nonetheless, chiefly by watching her face when she held different fabrics to the light, and seeing which ones made the tension around her eyes ease slightly. He helped her carry her delivery of a finished dress to the rancher's wife, Mrs. Eleanor Marsh, who turned out to be the wife of the same rancher whose horses Henry had found. Eleanor Marsh was a broad, warm woman with several opinions about everything, and she took an immediate and enormous liking to Lillian, declared the collar on the dress to be the finest work she'd seen this side of the Mississippi, and commissioned 2 more garments on the spot. She also invited them both to Sunday dinner the following week, which Lillian accepted with a careful grace and Henry accepted, because Eleanor did not really give you the option of declining. "She decided something about us," Lillian said as they walked back from the Marsh ranch, the late afternoon sun warm on their backs. "Several things, I imagine," Henry said. "She's not entirely wrong," Lillian said, and then seemed surprised that she'd said it and looked ahead at the road. Henry let the silence sit for a moment and then said, "She's not wrong at all from where I'm standing." And he left it there because he was not a man who pressed things, and because Lillian needed to come to things in her own time, and he understood that, and he was patient. But he was very much not indifferent. That had become clear to him in the particular way that clarity comes when you stop pretending you haven't noticed something. He had not come to Caldwell looking for anything except 3 stolen horses. He had found instead a woman who kept her hands too still and her eyes too watchful, and who had a mind so precise and so self-sufficient that it was almost armor, except that occasionally in unguarded moments, especially when she was bent over her sewing or looking at something far away through the parlor window, the armor slipped, and there was something underneath it that was so alive and tender and fierce that it made his chest ache. He did not tell her this. It was May. There was time. Robert Haynes arrived in Caldwell on the 28th of May, 1878, on a Thursday afternoon, on the southbound stage from Wichita. Henry saw him first. He was sitting outside the barber's shop, getting a haircut that he had been postponing for 2 weeks when the stage came in, and he knew the man immediately from the description Lillian had given him: well-dressed, authoritative carriage, dark hair with gray at the temples, a smile that arrived before the eyes committed to it. He was probably 45, and had the look of a man who had always gotten what he wanted, and had never quite adjusted to the idea that the habit might be breakable. Henry paid for his haircut, went straight to the boarding house and found Lillian in the parlor. "He's here," he said. "Just arrived. He'll be settling in somewhere and then he'll come looking." She set down her sewing, her face went very still. "All right," she said, "you don't have to face him today." "If I wait it gets worse," she said. "He's very good at preparation and positioning. The longer he has to establish himself here, the harder it becomes." She folded her hands in her lap and looked at them and then looked up. "I'd rather do it now on my terms." Henry nodded. "Where would you like to do it?" She thought about it. "The hotel dining room," she said. "Public, visible, respectable. He can't perform the concerned fiancé routine somewhere that the performance will be witnessed and judged. I'll come with you." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I'll come with you." She looked at him for a moment, and something moved through her expression that she didn't try to hide. "Thank you," she said, and it was very simple and very sincere, and he thought it might be the most honest thing she had said to him since they'd met. They found Robert Haynes at the hotel dining room less than an hour later, precisely as Lillian had predicted. He was seated and ordering coffee, and he looked up when they entered, and his expression went through three things very quickly: recognition, calculation, and then the carefully constructed charm, the smile arriving like a performance beginning. "Lillian," he said, rising, "I've been worried about you." Lillian walked to his table and stopped, and her posture was the straightest Henry had ever seen it, not braced against something but extended toward it. "Good afternoon, Mr. Haynes," she said, with a courtesy so precise it was the opposite of warmth. Robert Haynes looked at Henry over her shoulder. "And who is this?" "Henry Whitfield," Henry said, stepping up beside Lillian in a way that was not aggressive but was very deliberately present. "I'm acquainted with Miss Fletcher." Haynes measured him with a glance and apparently concluded, incorrectly, that Henry was not a serious concern. He turned back to Lillian with the smile. "I've come a long way, my dear. Can't we sit down and talk reasonably?" "We can talk here," Lillian said, standing briefly. "There is nothing to discuss beyond what I told you when I left. Our engagement is ended. I've made a life here. I'm asking you clearly and directly to return to St. Louis and leave me in peace." The smile tightened slightly. "You're being dramatic, Lillian. The things you imagined you knew about my business were misunderstandings. I can explain everything if you'd only let me." "I don't require explanations," she said. "I require that you understand me when I tell you this is not a conversation I am willing to continue. Not today, not tomorrow, not at any future time. I am not confused about what I saw and what I know. I am not coming back. If you have further business in Caldwell, it has nothing to do with me." Haynes's eyes went cold behind the smile. "You're making a very considerable mistake," he said, and his voice had dropped, the charming register slipping into something harder, a register that was probably quite effective in the drawing rooms of St. Louis. "I've made considerable mistakes," Lillian said calmly. "Becoming engaged to you is on the list. This is not." She turned and walked out, and Henry followed, and he did not look back at Robert Haynes because doing so would have suggested uncertainty, and there was none, and also because he was watching Lillian's back as she walked and making sure she was steady, and she was. She was absolutely steady, right until they were around the corner of the building and out of sight of the hotel's windows, and then she stopped walking and put one hand against the wall of the hardware store beside her and breathed. Henry stood close but did not crowd her. He waited. After a moment she said, "That was considerably more frightening than I made it look." "You made it look entirely unfrightening," he said. Which was exactly right. Is he the kind of man who takes no for an answer when it's delivered that clearly? Henry had been watching Haynes's face during the exchange. He had been watching closely. "He's angry," he said honestly. "Men like that don't surrender their sense of ownership easily. He'll be here at least another day, possibly two, trying to find an angle." "What do we do?" "The same thing we've been doing," Henry said. "You live your life. You're visible. You're part of this community. He cannot remove you quietly from a place where you're not a secret. And if he tries any direct harassment, there are people in this town who will take a dim view of a well-dressed stranger making trouble for a local woman." She looked up at him. She was very close in the narrow space between the buildings, close enough that he could see the particular pale ring around her irises and the way the tension in her jaw gradually, by increments, released. "You seem very sure of all this," she said. "I'm fairly sure of most of it," he said. "I'm entirely sure that you handled that correctly, and I'm entirely sure that whatever he does next, you are not alone in it." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she said, very quietly, "I have been alone in it for a very long time, since before St. Louis even. I don't entirely remember what it's like to have someone in my corner." "Then allow me to remind you," he said, and his voice was low and entirely serious, and something happened in the air between them, something that had been building for weeks and had been waiting for a moment with enough gravity to contain it. And Lillian's breath caught very slightly, and Henry's hand, which had been at his side, moved half an inch toward hers before he stopped it, because it was not yet the right moment, and he knew the difference, and he was patient. He was patient. Robert Haynes did not leave immediately. He spent 2 more days in Caldwell, and Henry tracked those days with care, keeping aware of where Haynes was and what he was doing. He was asking questions around town. Henry learned through the general store owner's wife, who seemed to know everything that happened within 3 blocks in any direction, questions about Lillian's circumstances, her acquaintances, her history. He was doing what he always did, constructing a picture he could use. But Caldwell was not St. Louis. The people Haynes spoke to had watched Lillian sew dresses for their wives and sit in their church pew and argue pleasantly with Perkins about thread prices, and a well-dressed stranger asking pointed questions about a local woman read, in a cattle town, as exactly the kind of overreach that people here did not have much patience for. By the second day, 2 different men had told him, in the direct and unadorned manner of the Kansas plains, that his inquiries were not welcome. On Friday morning of that week, Henry found Eleanor Marsh at the Caldwell post office, and he told her, carefully and without unnecessary detail, something of Lillian's situation, because Eleanor was exactly the sort of woman who, once she had decided to like a person, would go to considerable lengths to protect them, and she had very clearly decided to like Lillian. Eleanor's expression during this conversation passed through outrage, determination, and a kind of militant affection in approximately 30 seconds. "That dreadful man," she said. "He tried to speak to me yesterday." Very smooth, very polite, asking whether Lillian had been entirely of sound mind when she arrived in town, if you can imagine. She pulled herself up to her full considerable height. "I told him she was the most sound-minded woman I'd met in a decade, and that he might find the Kisham Trail more hospitable than Caldwell if he continued." Henry managed not to smile. "That was well done." "I'll say something to the Reverend's wife," Eleanor said. "She knows everyone. And I'll ask Gideon to speak to the sheriff, just so he's aware of the situation." She looked at Henry with the penetrating directness she reserved for important things. "You care very much about that young woman, Mr. Whitfield." He did not deny it. "Yes," he said simply. Eleanor nodded as if he had confirmed something she had known for some time. "Then stop being so infernally careful and tell her so before that man finds some way to take advantage of your restraint." Henry left the post office and thought about that. Robert Haynes left on the Saturday stage. Henry saw him go and watched the stage roll north toward Wichita, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem resolving, but also knew that it was not entirely over. A man like Haynes, humiliated and thwarted, did not simply release things. He retreated, recalculated, and tried again through different means. This was not a victory so much as a temporary advantage. He told Lillian this that evening on the porch again in what had become their habitual place for these conversations, with the last of the June light spreading rose and gold across the sky. "I know," she said. "He'll try something else, probably legal if he can find an angle. He has lawyers." "What angle would he have?" She was quiet for a moment. "When I left St. Louis, I took some letters with me. Letters that were written to me, correspondence that documented some of what I'd come to understand about his business. He might claim I stole documents. It wouldn't be true, but it would give him grounds to threaten legal action, and legal action is expensive and frightening, and that's the point of it. Do you still have the letters? Yes, in my room. She looked at her hands. I kept them because I thought if it ever came to a confrontation I might need them, to show that I had reason for what I did. Henry thought about this carefully. Then what you have is documentation of whatever you know about his business. Which means his wanting you silent is about more than wounded pride. Yes, she said, it always was. That changes things, he said. If his interest in you is about protecting himself from exposure, then the threat you represent is real and ongoing as long as you have those letters. She turned to look at him fully. I've thought about that too. There might be a way to make that threat go in both directions, he said slowly. If the right person knew about those letters, if their existence was documented somewhere, and someone other than you knew where they were, then Haynes moving against you would risk the very exposure he's trying to prevent. Lillian was very still, listening. I know a man in Wichita. Not a lawman exactly, but a man who works with the Federal Land Office and has connections to some of the Federal Circuit judges. He's a person of considerable integrity. I've done work for him before. If he were to know, in a general way, that certain letters existed and where they could be found if something were to happen to you, then the threat goes in both directions. You're suggesting I arm myself, she said. I'm suggesting that you already have a weapon, he said. You've just been carrying it in your pocket instead of holding it where it can be seen. She breathed out slowly. The rose and gold had deepened to amber and violet in the sky. A nighthawk made its strange, flat cry somewhere over the creek bottom. The town was settling into its evening sounds, the distant piano from the saloon, the lowing of cattle somewhere in the pens west of town. I have been so afraid for so long, she said quietly, and it was not a complaint, just an observation, said with a kind of wondering tiredness. I left everything I knew and came out here, and I've been so careful not to make a sound, not to be seen, not to need anything from anyone. And somewhere along the way it became the only thing I knew how to do. Henry looked at her. The lamp from inside the boarding house made a warm rectangle of light through the window and fell across her profile, and he thought he had never in his life been so aware of another person's presence as he was of hers in this moment. You don't have to keep doing it that way, he said. She turned to look at him, and their eyes met, and it was not like any of the careful, measured glances that had passed between them over the past weeks. This was different. This was direct and unshielded, and he saw everything in it, the fear and the loneliness and the fierce self-sufficiency, and the thing underneath all of that which was simply a person who had been managing alone for too long and who was, right now, looking at him without any of the armor. Henry, she said, and it was the first time she had called him by his given name, and the sound of it in her voice was something he thought he would remember for the rest of his life. Lillian, he said. And then, because he was Henry Whitfield and he did not do things without being certain, he asked, "May I?" And she said, "Yes," and he leaned forward on the porch bench and kissed her. It was a quiet kiss. Not urgent or dramatic. It was the kind of kiss that feels like the end of a very long journey, where you finally stop and put down what you have been carrying and realize that your hands have been aching for some time without you fully admitting it. He felt her tense for a fraction of a second, the automatic defense, and then it went out of her like the last light going from the sky, and she kissed him back, and it was warm and real and entirely certain. When they separated, she pressed her forehead against his for a moment, and he put his hand against her jaw, careful and light. "I did not come out here for this," she said softly. "I know," he said. "Neither did I." She laughed, a small and startled and genuinely happy sound that he had not heard from her before, and it was perhaps the best sound he had encountered in 30 years on the earth. They rode to Wichita the following week, a 2-day trip with a night camping by the Arkansas River under a sky that was so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled a jar of light. Henry made a separate camp, a respectful distance from hers, because he was a person of genuine decency, and she teased him about it in the morning. which was how he discovered that her sense of humor was dry and light and very sharp when she let it out, like a knife you hadn't known she was carrying. The man in Wichita was named John Terrell, a square-faced, steady man in his early 50s who had worked with the Federal Land Office for 20 years and had seen a great many varieties of human dishonesty and was not impressed by any of them. He listened to Lillian's account of Robert Haynes with the patient, precise attention of a man who understood the uses of information, and he examined the letter she had brought, and he looked at her over his reading glasses and said, "You should have come to someone like me 6 months ago." "I didn't know someone like you existed," she said. "They generally don't, until you need one." He made copies of the letters, had her sign a sworn statement describing their contents and provenance, and sealed everything with his official seal and put it in a locked cabinet. "I'll also write to an associate of mine who handles civil matters in St. Louis," he said. "Not to take any immediate action, but simply to document that this situation exists and that the relevant parties are aware of it." He looked at Henry. "You did right to bring her here." Henry glanced at Lillian. "She did right to come," he said. On the ride back from Wichita, with the prairie opening up around them in the warm afternoon, Lillian rode beside Henry and the distance between their horses gradually closed without either of them particularly intending it, the way things do when they are drawn toward each other by something too persistent to ignore. "I keep waiting for something to go wrong," she said. "That's a reasonable thing to feel." "Is it always like this? Waiting for the other shoe to drop?" Henry thought about it honestly. "I think it depends on whether you let the waiting do the living for you," he said. "Things might go wrong. He might try something else. But you have more to stand on now than you did 6 months ago, and next month you'll have more than you have today, and at some point the weight shifts." She looked at him. "You are an unusual man, Henry Whitfield. So I've been told." "I mean it as a compliment," she said. "I know," he said, and smiled at the horizon, and she smiled at the same horizon, and they rode back to Caldwell in the particular happiness of two people who have found each other in a place neither expected, which is the very best way to find someone. Summer came on with the full force of a Kansas summer, which is to say relentlessly and without apology. The heat settled over Caldwell like a hand pressed flat, and the cattle drives came through in long, lowing streams, filling the town with dust and noise and trail-dirty cowboys who spent their wages in a weekend and were gone again by Monday. Henry found himself more and more reliably present, less and less inclined to move on to the next job in the next county, though jobs still found him with predictable regularity. Lillian's sewing business had grown. She had 5 steady clients among the ranchers' wives and 2 more in town, and she had hired a girl named Lucy, 15 and quick-fingered, to help with the plain work while Lillian focused on the detail and finishing work that commanded the better prices. She had moved from Mrs. Beaumont's single room to a slightly larger room with a proper work table by the window, and the room had acquired in the weeks of summer the particular character of a place that has been lived in by someone with taste and intention. Her thread collection, arranged by color in a painted tin box, a small framed print of wildflowers above the work table, books borrowed from Eleanor Marsh lined neatly on the window ledge. Henry had taken to spending his evenings at the boarding house rather than at the saloon where some of the other transient men gathered, and Mrs. Beaumont had long since stopped pretending she was surprised by this, and had begun leaving an extra cup out for him at supper, which was the closest she came to expressing warmth, and he appreciated it accordingly. One evening in July, he sat on the porch while Lillian worked inside the parlor with the lamp, and he could see her shadow through the window, the steady bend and move of her at her work, and he thought about the future with a directness he had not allowed himself in years. He was not a man who had planned for much. He had moved through the territory from job to job for a decade, finding things, being useful, asking for nothing permanent. It had suited him, or at least he had told himself it did, in the way you tell yourself a quiet, solitary life is a principled choice rather than simply the path of least resistance. Lillian had changed that calculation entirely, without meaning to and without asking him to. He had discovered, over the course of the spring and summer, that he wanted a morning that contained a specific person in it. He wanted an evening that ended with a voice he knew. He wanted to be found as surely as he found, and that was new, and it was startling, and it was absolutely certain. He brought it up, as he brought most things up, on the porch in the evening in the slant of late summer light. He had a small house outside of town, he told her, which was mostly true. It was more of an ongoing construction than a finished house, a place he'd been building in fits, and starts on a 10-acre parcel he'd purchased 2 years ago when the thought first occurred to him that moving indefinitely might eventually require somewhere to move back to. The land was good, he told her, sitting along a small creek with good grass and 3 cottonwoods that shaded the yard in the afternoon. It needed a great deal of work. He had windows to put in, and a proper floor to lay, and a kitchen to build off the back. She had been listening with the focused, evaluating attention she gave to things that mattered, and when he paused she said, "You're telling me about a house, but I think you're asking me something." "I am," he said. "Then ask it," she said. He turned to look at her squarely because she deserved that. "I'm asking if you would be willing to make Caldwell permanent," he said, "and if you would consider, in whatever time frame makes sense to you, being willing to be here with me. Formally. In the traditional manner that involves a preacher and a witness, and a ring if you'd accept one." She looked at him for a long moment. The last of the summer light caught the complicated gray of her eyes. "A month ago I would have told you I was not available for anything traditional," she said. "I know," he said. "And 3 months ago I was trying to disappear entirely." "I know that too." She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "Henry, I need you to understand that I am not uncomplicated. I have a great deal of history that I haven't told you yet, and there are days when I still wake up expecting to need to run, and I am not entirely healed of whatever it is that St. Louis left in me, and I may be, in some fundamental way, more difficult to live with than you've yet encountered. I've been tracking difficult things my whole life," he said. "I'm not frightened of complicated." She looked at her hands and then looked up, and the thing that had been sitting in her face, guarded and restrained, simply released. "Yes," she said. "The answer is yes, with the understanding that we are building something and I am still, in some ways, learning to trust the ground under my feet. That's all I'm asking," he said, and took her hand and held it, and that was that. They were married in September of 1878, in the small frame church at the end of Main Street, on a Saturday afternoon when the light had that particular golden quality that September light has on the Kansas plains, clear and slanting and slightly sad with the knowledge of what comes after, but warm as long as it lasted. Eleanor Marsh cried noisily and provided the wedding cake. Mrs. Beaumont stood very straight in the front row and permitted herself a small, satisfied smile. John Terrell came down from Wichita with his wife and stood as witness. Lucy, the girl who helped with the sewing, scattered dried wildflowers in the aisle with great enthusiasm. Lillian wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with a fitted bodice, and a collar she had embroidered with small blue flowers over the course of 3 evenings, working by lamplight while Henry sat on the other side of the parlor and read, and occasionally looked up at her, with an expression he no longer tried to hide. It was the finest thing she had ever sewn, and she knew it was the finest, and she wore it with the ease of someone who has finally stopped pretending not to inhabit their own life. Henry wore a clean white shirt, and his least worn trousers, and a jacket borrowed from Gideon Marsh that fit him reasonably well in the shoulders, and he stood at the front of the church and watched Lillian walk down the aisle with the same intensity with which he watched a trail, which is to say completely, and with the clear understanding that nothing before or after was as important as this. The Reverend read the words and they said the vows, and Henry's voice was steady and Lillian's voice was steady. And when he put the ring on her finger, a simple band of silver that he'd had made by the jeweler in Wichita, she looked at it for a moment and then looked up at him with the most open and unconstrained expression he had ever seen on her face, Nothing held back, nothing guarded, just Lillian. They moved to the house outside of town that same week, and the following weeks were occupied with the comfortable, particular happiness of making a place into a home. Henry put in the windows and the proper floor while Lillian hung curtains she sewed from fabric that Eleanor Marsh brought, blue cotton, with a small white pattern that moved like water in the afternoon breeze. They built a kitchen garden together in the plot south of the house, planting what would overwinter and planning the spring beds in the long evenings. Henry finished the kitchen addition in October, and Lillian cooked their first proper dinner in it while the first cold wind of autumn came down from the north, and they ate it together at the pine table Henry had made, and it tasted like something more than food. There was a letter from John Terrell in October that read, simply, that he had received word from his associate in St. Louis that Robert Haynes had become the subject of a federal inquiry into certain financial improprieties, which had occupied his complete attention, and it appeared his interest in matters in Kansas had been substantially redirected. The letter was brief and entirely satisfying. Lillian read it twice and then set it on the kitchen table and looked out the window at the cottonwoods along the creek for a long moment. "Is it over?" Henry asked from the doorway. "I think so," she said, "or as over as these things get." She turned. "I don't think I'll stop looking over my shoulder entirely for some time yet." "That's all right," he said. "I'll be here." She smiled at him with the full warmth that she had been learning over the months since May to give freely. It was the kind of smile that rearranged the room around it, and he had not gotten used to it, and he was glad he hadn't, because some things should always be capable of stopping you in your tracks. Winter came down on the plains in November with the blunt force of a Kansas winter, and the house, which Henry had built with care over several years of intermittent work, turned out to be warm and solid and well suited to the purpose, the walls thick and the windows tight and the wood stove in the front room generous. The cattle drives had ended for the season and Caldwell quieted to its winter tempo, smaller and closer and more itself, and Henry and Lillian fell into the rhythms of a life together that was both new and entirely natural. The way two rivers meeting can seem as though they always flowed this way. Henry continued his tracking work through the winter months, shorter trips and less dramatic than the summer range, mostly farm disputes and lost stock and the occasional missing person that the sheriff was glad to hand over to someone with a better success rate. Lillian continued her sewing, working now in the light-filled front room with the cotton curtains, and she had begun, quietly, to teach Lucy in the afternoons twice a week, not just sewing but reading and basic arithmetic, because Lillian had come to the conclusion that usefulness was its own kind of healing, and she had a great deal to give. In the evenings they read aloud to each other, or Henry played the fiddle, which he was middling at but enjoyed, and Lillian would look up from her work and sometimes close her eyes while he played, not minding the missed notes, and sometimes she sang along in a clear, low voice that surprised him the first time, and continued to fill him with an uncomplicated pleasure every time after. They had disagreements. They had them with the realistic frequency of two people with strong minds sharing a small space, and they learned each other's particular shapes, the way she needed to work through anxiety through activity and hated to be crowded in it, the way he went very quiet when something troubled him and needed to be asked directly rather than waited on. They figured these things out mostly by getting them wrong first and then adjusting, which was both frustrating and intimate, and which built something between them that was stronger for having been constructed from real material rather than wishful thinking. In January of 1879, Henry came home from a 3-day job tracking some stolen cattle west of the Strip and found Lillian sitting at the kitchen table with a very particular expression on her face, which was the expression of someone who has information they have been processing alone and is now ready to share it. "I'm going to need you to sit down," she said. He sat down. "I believe we are going to have a child," she said. In the summer, if my calculations are correct. Henry sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "In the summer," and his voice sounded slightly different from usual, and Lillian looked at him with the careful attention of someone who is watching to see how a thing lands. "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. "Lillian," he said and stopped, and she could see him going through several things at once, surprise and joy and the particular tender terror of a man who is being handed something precious. "Are you well? How are you feeling?" "Quite well," she said. "Slightly less well in the mornings, but otherwise well." He pressed his forehead to her hands, and she felt his breath against her knuckles, and she reached up with one hand and put it on the back of his head, and they stayed like that for a moment in the January stillness, the wood stove ticking, the wind working at the eaves. "A summer baby," he said against her hands. "A summer baby," she agreed. He looked up at her with the entirety of what he felt fully visible in his face, because Henry Whitfield was not a man who hid things from the person he loved, and he said, "I was not expecting any of this, you know, not a single piece of it. I came here to find 3 stolen horses." "I came here to disappear," she said. "Well," he said, and his voice had a quality in it that was both rueful and joyful in equal measure, "you did an exceptionally poor job of it." She laughed, and it was the big, real laugh that she had been growing into over the months of their life together, the one that was still slightly surprising to her, as if she had not entirely gotten used to the space that happiness takes up. Henry laughed with her, and outside the wind went cold and sharp around the corners of the house, and inside the wood stove burned warm and steady. Spring came again to the Kansas plains in the way that spring always comes after a hard winter, extravagant and almost aggressive in its greenness. The grass coming up new along the creek, and the cottonwoods putting out their first pale leaves, and the meadowlarks singing in the fence posts along the road to town. Lillian's garden came up early in the warm spring, and Henry built a proper fence around it to keep the rabbits out. And they planted an apple tree on the south side of the house that would take years to bear fruit, but which Lillian planted with the deliberate confidence of someone who intends to be there to see it. Henry took a job in April that kept him east of Caldwell for a week, and when he came back, he brought Lillian a small brass compass from a tradesman he'd met near Council Grove, not because she needed it, but because he had looked at it in the tradesman's pack and thought of her immediately. Her particular way of navigating things, by instinct and observation, and the kind of deep internal knowing that some people have for the shape of the land. She kept the compass on the worktable beside her thread collection, and sometimes when she was thinking she would turn it in her fingers, feeling the cool weight of it. The baby arrived on the 14th of July, 1879, on a Tuesday morning that was already hot by 6 o'clock, and showed every intention of becoming more so. Eleanor Marsh came out 2 days before Lillian's time as a precaution and stayed, which was entirely characteristic of Eleanor, and the Caldwell doctor came when things were well advanced, and Henry was banished to the porch by Eleanor in a manner that brooked no argument, and sat there for 4.5 hours in the July heat thinking things that were too large to organize into thoughts, just feelings, enormous and wordless. The baby was a boy. He was a large, healthy, indignant boy who announced his arrival with considerable volume and seemed to find the entire situation more aggravating than expected. Lillian held him in the light from the bedroom window with the particular new mother expression, exhausted and rapt and slightly unbelieving, and Henry sat beside her on the edge of the bed and looked at his son, who was red-faced and squinting at the light, and felt something that had no name in any language but was essentially the experience of the world rearranging itself around a new fundamental. "He looks like someone who has opinions," Henry said. "He comes by that honestly," Lillian said, and looked at Henry with the frank and total warmth that was entirely her own, nobody else's, the expression that was only for him, and he kissed her temple and put his arm around her with very great care. "What do we call him?" she asked. They had talked about names back and forth over the spring without settling anything. Henry had held off on pushing for his own preferences, sensing that Lillian had views and would find her way to them. Now she looked at the baby and said, "James, I think, James Henry, after you and after my father before the trouble." "James Henry Whitfield," Henry said quietly, trying the weight of it. "That's a good name." "It is," she agreed and looked at her son, and her expression was so open and certain and undefended that Henry thought, this is what she looked like before whatever happened to make her armor herself. This is who she actually is, this woman right here, and she got here, and we got here, and it is everything. He was a man of few dramatic declarations. He showed what he felt through his hands and his attention and his presence, and Lillian had come to read him precisely as he had come to read her. But in the July heat with his wife and his son, and the meadowlarks outside the window, and the apple tree on the south side of the house that would one day bear fruit, he said, "I want you to know that I am grateful every day that you did such a poor job of disappearing." She turned her head against his shoulder. "I want you to know that I am grateful every day that you are exactly the kind of man who cannot leave something unfinished." They sat like that for a long time in the afternoon heat, while James Henry Whitfield slept with the deep, unconscious certainty of someone who has arrived exactly where he is supposed to be. The years that followed were the particular texture of a life that is genuinely happy, which is to say they were neither simple nor without difficulty, but they were full and real and grounded in the same bedrock of mutual recognition that had been established on a porch in Caldwell in the spring of 1878. Henry's tracking work evolved as the territory evolved. By 1880, the cattle trade was already beginning to shift, the trails changing as the railheads moved and the nesters pushed further south, and Caldwell was reinventing itself as the terminals adjusted. Henry worked for the cattlemen and increasingly for the land office and the county, doing survey work and investigation, and occasionally consulting for the federal marshals on cases that needed his particular skills, because men who could read the land the way he could were rare and useful. He was good at this work, and he knew it, and he was not modest about knowing it, though he was entirely without arrogance about it, which was the important distinction. Lillian's sewing business grew into something more substantial than she had planned. By 1880, when she had outgrown the front room, and Henry built a small workroom off the back of the house, properly lit with the best windows he could source, and she had 3 girls working with her in addition to Lucy, who had grown into a remarkably capable young woman and was Lillian's right hand in the enterprise. More importantly, Lillian had begun keeping ledgers for the business herself, and had discovered, as she had suspected she might, that her instinct for numbers was sharper than her instinct for self-erasure, and she found a deep satisfaction in the honest accounting of things, the way the columns balanced, the way the numbers told the truth of the work. She did not entirely stop being watchful. She would have told you honestly that she probably never would entirely stop, but the watching had changed in quality. It was no longer the watching of prey. It was the watching of someone who knows the shape of the land and trusts her footing in it, who looks because she is curious and interested and alive, not because she is afraid. Robert Haynes was convicted in federal court in St. Louis in the spring of 1881 on charges related to fraud and certain financial arrangements that John Terrell's associate had helped to bring to light. The sentence was 5 years. Lillian read the notice in the Kansas paper that Eleanor Marsh brought her with a feeling she had difficulty naming, something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, but was more like the final lifting of a weight she had been so accustomed to carrying that she had almost forgotten what her own shoulders felt like without it. "It's over," Henry said, reading over her shoulder. "Yes," she said. And then she folded the paper very neatly and set it on the table and said, "I'm going to take James to see the creek this afternoon. He's been asking about the turtles." "I'll come," Henry said. "I was counting on it," she said. In the fall of 1881, Lillian found herself, as Henry gently phrased it, in an interesting situation which resulted in the birth, in May of 1882, of a second child. This one was a girl, small and dark-haired, and from the first day of her life possessed of an expression of supreme self-possession that made Eleanor Marsh say she was the absolute mirror of her mother, which Lillian took as the enormous compliment that it was intended to be. They named her Clara, after Mrs. Beaumont, who had died the previous winter after a short illness, and who Lillian had sat with in the last weeks, reading aloud and keeping company, and who had died with the satisfied expression of a woman who had seen things come right that she had expected to come right, and had simply been waiting to confirm it. Mrs. Beaumont had not been a sentimental person, but she had, in her own way, been the first person in Caldwell to extend something that felt like kindness to Lillian Fletcher, when Lillian had not been at all certain she deserved it, and Lillian did not forget that. Clara Whitfield came into the world with the same indignant energy as her brother before her, and settled into it with the same broad confidence, and the four of them, Henry and Lillian and James and Clara, arranged themselves into the specific and unrepeatable shape of their particular family with the ease of things that are meant to fit together. James grew into a serious, observant boy with his father's gift for noticing things and his mother's precision. By the time he was 4, he was following Henry on his shorter tracking jobs, pointing to things in the grass and asking with perfect seriousness whether that was a mark and what it meant. And Henry answered every question with the same care and honesty he brought to everything, and Lillian would sometimes watch them from the kitchen window, the tall, lean man and the small, intent boy with their heads bent together over some mark in the earth, and feel the kind of fullness that is almost aching. So much of it that it could not be contained quietly. The house had grown too. Henry had added a second room above the main floor in 1880, with a proper staircase, and in 1882 he extended the porch to run the full length of the south side of the house, with a rail he'd ordered from the mill in Wichita and fitted himself, and a bench at the east end where the afternoon light fell in a particular way that was, in Lillian's considered opinion, the finest place in Caldwell County to sit and watch the evening come on. They sat there often, in the way they had sat on Mrs. Beaumont's porch in that first spring, when everything had been uncertain and new, and she had been so afraid of being found. They sat there with the children playing in the yard, and the apple tree on the south side of the house, now tall enough to cast real shade, and the cottonwoods along the creek bright green in summer and gold in October and bare and silver in winter, and the meadowlarks always in the fence posts, and the sky always that enormous Kansas sky that went on so far in every direction that it had seemed threatening to her once and now seemed simply like space, the right amount of space. The world being honest about its own proportions. Henry would sometimes find her sitting there in the early morning before the children were up, with her coffee and her straight spine and her gray eyes looking at the distance, and she would hear him come out and not turn, but simply move over slightly on the bench to make room for him, and he would sit down and take her hand, and they would sit in the morning together, neither of them needing to say anything, because everything that needed to be said had been said, mostly, over the years. In the way that people who have built a life together say things with their bodies and their habits and their presence, the accumulated daily evidence of a choice made and remade and never regretted. In the summer of 1883, Henry took a commission from the Federal Land Office that required him to spend 3 weeks mapping a disputed boundary along the southern Kansas and Cherokee Strip edge, a job that took him away from home for longer than usual. He wrote letters every few days when he was near a stage route, and Lillian wrote back, and his letters were not flowery or literary because he was not a flowery or literary man, but they were Henry, precise and warm and honest, and she kept them in the brass-hinged box on her work table that had gradually replaced the thread collection as the thing she kept closest to hand. When he came back, she was standing on the porch when his horse came up the lane, because James had seen the dust of him from the east window and come running to tell her, and she had set down her sewing and come out and stood at the porch rail in the late afternoon light. And Henry rode up and swung down from the saddle and came up the porch steps and put his arms around her, and she put her face against his chest and breathed. 3 weeks, she said. 14 days longer than I wanted, he said. She looked up at him. He was sunburned and tired and entirely himself. She said, I was perfectly capable of managing without you. I know, he said. So was I. It still felt too long. She kissed him, right there on the porch in the late afternoon, with James jumping around their legs demanding to know whether he had brought anything back from the strip, and Clara watching from the doorway with the judicial expression that she had inherited so completely from her mother, and the apple tree casting its good shade over the south side of the yard, and the meadowlarks in the fence posts sending up their clear, extravagant song. He had brought James a horn-handled pocket knife, the appropriate kind for a boy of 4 who was already asking for one, and Clara a piece of red ribbon from a trading post near the strip that she examined with the gravity of a queen receiving tribute. He brought Lillian a small piece of turquoise, flat and smooth, that he had found in the creek bed of a dry wash in the strip country, the color of a sky just after rain. She turned it in her fingers and felt the cool weight of it, the same way she sometimes turned the brass compass. It's the color of something I haven't been able to name, he said, watching her hold it. Hope, she said after a moment and looked up at him. It's the color of hope, not the desperate kind, the settled kind. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded, as if she had confirmed something he had been thinking. Yes, he said, that's exactly what it is. Lillian Fletcher had come to the Kansas territory in the spring of 1878 with $42 and a plan to become no one. She had come to disappear into the vastness of the frontier, to make herself small enough and quiet enough that the thing she was running from could not find the shape of her in all that open space. She had chosen her town carefully, timed her disappearance deliberately, kept her head down and her shoulders inward and her eyes on the door. And Henry Whitfield had found her anyway, not because he had been looking for her specifically, which was the part she thought about sometimes with something between amusement and wonder. He had not been sent to find her. He had not been tracking her. He had simply been a man with a particular gift for noticing things that were present, whether or not they wanted to be noticed, and she had been present in a very specific and impossible-to-miss way, sitting with her overpacked bag and her storm-colored eyes in a boarding-house parlor at a table she had already calculated her distance from the door from. He had found her the way he found everything, by looking honestly and being patient and not deciding what the answer was before the evidence was in. She had needed finding. She had not known she needed finding. She had thought she needed invisibility, which turned out to be the wrong solution to the right problem. The problem was not that she was too visible. The problem was that she had been carrying everything alone for so long that she had confused the weight with herself, had come to think the armor was her skin. What she had needed was not to disappear, but to be seen clearly by someone who would not flinch from what they saw, and who would stand beside her in the seeing rather than using it against her. He had been that. He had been exactly that, with no drama and no fanfare, simply by being a man who found things that needed finding and stayed with them when they were found. She kept the turquoise piece on the work table beside the brass compass, and sometimes in the early mornings, before Henry came downstairs and before the children woke, she would sit in the good light from the east window and hold the turquoise in one hand and the compass in the other, the cool weight of both, and look out at the yard and the apple tree and the cottonwoods along the creek. And she would think about the woman who had stepped off the stage in Caldwell in 1878 with her hat pulled low and her plan to cease to exist. And she would feel, without any of the old fear, simply this, the steady, warm, unremarkable, entirely extraordinary truth of a life that had been found. Outside, the Kansas morning opened up the way it always did, enormous and clear and without apology, the sky going from black to purple to the particular burning gold of the plains at dawn, and the meadowlark started in the fence posts, and smoke began to curl from the kitchen chimney, where Henry was already up and stoking the fire. And James came down the stairs with his boots in one hand and an important question about whether there were tracks in the frost this morning. And Clara sat at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, eating an apple with the absolute composure of someone who finds everything perfectly in order. And the apple tree outside the south window had grown tall enough now that you could see it from everywhere in the yard, and someday it would bear fruit, and it would bear it for a long time, because the roots had gone deep into the good Kansas ground, and what is well-rooted does not move, and what does not move can finally, fully, without reservation, be called home.